When Christopher Columbus first set foot in the New World, an era of great geographical discoveries had begun. Yet, it also planted the seeds of an unprecedented nightmare. The celebrated hero who found the Americas would, in time, be unmasked. What terrifying truths lay hidden behind the dazzling glory of a man long honored by history? Christopher Columbus was born in the Republic of Genoa, but in 1476 he moved to Portugal, where he began taking part in numerous grand voyages. In the 15th century, European trade flourished and the drive to expand markets fueled the search for new sea routes to the east. Columbus proposed a bold plan to sail westward across the Atlantic Ocean in order to reach Asia. After repeated rejections, he turned to the Spanish crown for support. Eventually, Queen Isabella I granted him the funding for what would become one of the most famous voyages in history. On the morning of October 12, 1492, Columbus took command of 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, accompanied by a crew of 88 men departing from the port of Palos. They first sailed south to the Canary Islands, taking advantage of favorable easterly winds. After restocking supplies there, the fleet set a new course westward on the 6th of month missing. Conditions were favorable, and they soon sailed beyond areas unmarked on any European map. In the first 10 days, they covered over 1,100 miles. But by the 19th, unease began to spread among the crew, as no land had yet appeared, even after repeated attempts to measure the ocean's depth. On the 0th of October, a sudden appearance of migrating birds brought renewed hope. Columbus decided to follow their flight path. Even so, suspicion among the sailors grew. Under pressure, the captains agreed that if land was not sighted within 3 more days, they would turn back. Nature soon offered further encouragement. A fresh green branch floating on the water suggested land was near. At around 2 a.m. on October 12, a sailor aboard the Pinta spotted a faint white shape on the horizon. This time, there was no mistake. Land was indeed ahead. By sunrise, they approached the island, ending their dramatic Atlantic crossing. By midday on October 12, Columbus and his crew became the first Spaniards to set foot on this new territory. He named the island San Salvador, believing himself the first to discover it, for the inhabitants were nearly unclothed and clearly neither Chinese nor Indian. Little is known today about the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean at that time. First, they had no writing system, leaving no written records. Second, their oral traditions were almost entirely erased under Spanish colonial rule. As a result, nearly all information about them comes from European sources, accounts that were inevitably biased. One of the most enduring misconceptions from the early years of New World exploration was Columbus's decision to call the inhabitants Indians. When he first landed in the Caribbean, he believed he had reached islands near the eastern coast of India. The misnomer was quickly adopted by Spanish colonizers and over time became a common label for hundreds of distinct peoples across the Americas.
At first, Columbus seemed genuinely moved by the warmth and generosity of the native people on the island of San Salvador. Yet behind this outward gratitude, a colder calculation began to surface in his journal. He noted that the islanders would make ideal servants due to their gentle nature, quick intelligence, and lack of any clear religious system. He even wrote that, with God's permission, the expedition would take some of them back to Europe so they could learn basic sign language communication. When members of the Taíno community spoke of countless other islands to the west, Columbus ordered the ships to set sail again, taking 6 captives along as guides. In the days that followed, the expedition reached many new lands, each rich with unusual flora, strange vines, tall stalks of maize, and sweet potatoes thriving in the fertile soil. On October 28th, they dropped anchor off the coast of Cuba, filled with renewed hope A small party ventured inland in search of signs of Chinese or Japanese civilization, but returned empty-handed, carrying only stories of an unfamiliar custom. They had witnessed local inhabitants burning dried leaves and inhaling the rising smoke, entering a state of serene contentment. This was the first recorded encounter by Europeans with the use of tobacco. Rumors of gold began to spread through conversations with the indigenous people. Columbus heard of a place called Bojio, where shining metal could supposedly be gathered along the shoreline. Enthralled by this prospect, the Pinta's captain, Martín Pinzón, quietly broke away from the fleet with his crew to search for treasure. Columbus, undeterred, pressed onward with the remaining 2 ships. On December 8th, he reached another lush island whose green landscapes reminded him of his peaceful homeland. He named it La Española, Hispaniola. As in previous encounters, the local communities welcomed the newcomers with open arms. In his journal, Columbus observed the village chiefs adorned in elaborate gold jewelry and dressed in finery. Most of all, he noted the people were shy, compliant, and could easily be directed to work as he wished. By now, his focus had shifted decisively from finding a new route to Asia to claiming and ruling these lands. On December 22nd, Columbus received an invitation from Guacanagari, a powerful chief in northwestern Hispaniola, accompanied by a belt of finely worked gold. Tempted by the gesture, Columbus set sail for the chief's village. But disaster struck en route. Exhausted after a night of revelry, the crew failed to keep watch, and the Santa Maria ran aground on a coral reef during Christmas Eve night. With help from Guacanagari and his villagers, most of the crew and cargo were saved. But now, Columbus had only the smaller Niña, which could not carry everyone back to Spain.
This gave him the perfect pretext to act on a plan he had likely been considering, establishing a permanent outpost. He ordered the Santa Maria dismantled and used its timbers to build a small fortress on a sandy hill in the northwest of Hispaniola. 39 men were chosen to remain behind as a garrison, representing the Spanish crown. It was now clear that Columbus saw the island's inhabitants not as partners in exploration, but as a people to be exploited and potentially enslaved. On January 4, 1493, Columbus and the Niña began the first leg of their return journey. 2 days later, they reunited with the Pinta. The news Pinzón brought back was enough for Columbus to overlook his earlier desertion. They had ventured deep into Hispaniola and discovered significant quantities of gold. Yet the joy was short-lived. A brief skirmish with the Taíno and Samanabe escalated into a bloody clash. Not wishing to risk further conflict, Columbus ordered an immediate departure, taking several indigenous prisoners with him to serve as living proof of his discoveries. The return crossing was treacherous. Both ships battled relentless storms, at times nearly sinking beneath the violent Atlantic waves. He even lost contact with the Pinta, fearing it had been lost forever. Finally, on February 18, the Niña limped into the Azores. Strong headwinds then forced them to dock in Lisbon rather than their intended port in Spain. There, Columbus anxiously awaited the reaction of King John II of Portugal, a rival monarch who had once rejected his proposal. On hearing the news, the king reportedly sighed with regret that such an opportunity had slipped from his grasp. After a brief stay, Columbus was allowed to continue his journey home. On March 15, after 224 days at sea, the Niña arrived back in Palos. To his surprise, Martín Pinzón had reached Spain ahead of him, but lay gravely ill. He died before revealing the full truth about what had transpired in the New World. Around March 20, Columbus and his entourage, dressed in exotic clothing and carrying strange artifacts, including gold, entered the royal court. They were welcomed as heroes returning from a distant and unknown realm. Columbus was granted the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea and given the expectation of soon extracting immense wealth from the lands he had claimed. From the perspective of the crown's investors, however, the voyage was a disappointment.
The promised advanced civilizations of the East remained a fantasy, replaced instead by a handful of tropical islands, unusual plants, and friendly but uncivilized natives. Moreover, Columbus concealed certain crucial facts from his reports, particularly the loss of the Santa Maria. Still, he skillfully composed letters in 1493 that rekindled royal confidence and secured funding for another expedition. This time, the mission's purpose would be far more explicit: to establish a formal Spanish colony in the newly discovered lands.
In September 1493, a far larger expedition than before set sail from Cadiz. 17 ships carrying some 1,200 people. Among them were priests to spread the Christian faith, soldiers ready to use force if necessary, craftsmen, settlers, and even livestock for permanent settlement. The mission this time was clear: to establish a lasting Spanish colony in the newly claimed territories. Along the route, Columbus's fleet discovered several additional islands, including Guadalupe and Puerto Rico. But when they reached the small fortress in northwestern Hispaniola, built from the remains of the Santa Maria, they found only ruins. Every soldier left to guard the outpost had been killed. The cause was traced to violent conflict between the Spanish garrison and the Taíno people over gold and local women. Rather than rebuild the old fort, Columbus decided to establish a new settlement on the northern coast of Hispaniola. He named it La Isabela in honor of Queen Isabella I. Soon after, he left part of his forces there and resumed exploring in search of more islands and possible routes to Asia. From this point onward, the darker side of his rule became unmistakable. The voyage was marred by repeated clashes with the indigenous people. Several Carib communities were accused of cannibalism, allegations that may have been exaggerated or entirely fabricated to justify Spanish military attacks and massacres. Columbus turned his attention to the southern coast of Cuba, but despite extensive surveying, he found nothing to match the riches he had promised the crown. In a desperate move to preserve his reputation, he forced his entire crew to swear an oath that this coastline was part of the Asian mainland they had long sought. Anyone who violated the oath would have their tongue cut out. When he returned to La Isabela in June 1494, the settlement was already on the brink of collapse. His brother Diego, left in charge, had proven powerless against the mounting crises. The settlers were deeply disillusioned by the harsh environment, food shortages, disease, and Columbus's increasingly authoritarian leadership. Complaints began to circulate quietly across the ocean, carried by letters to the Spanish court. The greed of the expedition soon pushed the colonists into open conflict with the Taíno people of Hispaniola. Their resistance, though fierce, was met with brutal Spanish warfare, including cavalry charges and the use of war dogs. The relatively peaceful stance Columbus had once shown toward the islanders vanished entirely. Frustrated by the meager amounts of gold discovered, he devised a far more ruthless plan: to turn the native population into a commodity. Around 1,500 Taínos were captured. Nearly a third of them were shipped to Spain to be sold as slaves. The transatlantic journey proved deadly. Most did not survive the harsh conditions at sea. The Spanish crown quickly realized that enslaving the indigenous people was not only morally questionable, but also unprofitable. They ordered an immediate end to all shipments of native slaves to Europe. Those who remained in Hispaniola fared little better. Columbus allowed his soldiers to claim any women they wished, then released the rest into the wilderness, where many fled in terror, abandoning their children. Unable to meet the impossible quotas of gold demanded by the crown, punishable by mutilation or death, the surviving Taínos withdrew into the mountains, preferring starvation to capture. In the Antilles, Spanish conquest brought waves of destruction that would eventually erase entire communities. According to research by the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation, Hispaniola's native population, estimated at about 250,000 in 1492, had fallen to just 14,000 by 1517.
Some historians believe that up to 90% of the indigenous people of the Americas perished within decades of European contact, a catastrophe greater in scale than the Black Death in Europe. The devastation had two primary causes. First was epidemic disease, measles, smallpox, and other deadly pathogens carried by Europeans to which the islanders had no immunity. Entire villages were wiped out in a matter of years. Second was systemic exploitation. From the very start of the occupation, the Spanish sought to turn the natives into forced laborers, and Columbus himself took the lead in organizing slave raids to ship captives to Europe. By March 1496, Columbus returned to Spain after this deeply controversial voyage. The mood of his reception had changed. Gone was the unreserved celebration of 3 years earlier. Despite his skill in framing events to defend himself, growing numbers now questioned the truth of his earlier claims. It was increasingly clear that he had not reached India or China, and the new world he had found did not contain the vast treasures he had promised. The few surviving natives showed little interest in conversion or submission. The Spanish court's confidence in Columbus began to waver. Yet, out of fear that rival powers might seize the remaining opportunities, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella reluctantly continued to back him. In 1498, he was granted permission to undertake a third voyage, financed largely by selling the Taíno slaves he had previously transported to Spain. Though it would not be recognized as such at the time, this next journey would lead Columbus to one of his most important geographical discoveries. Although few recognized its importance at the time, Columbus's third voyage would become one of the most significant in his career. Departing in May 1498, he not only discovered the island of Trinidad, but also became the first known European to set foot on the South American mainland. On an August morning, he reached the coast of what is now Venezuela, approaching the shoreline near the mouth of the mighty Orinoco River. At first, he assumed he had found yet another large island, but as he sailed along the coast, the immense flow of fresh water convinced him that only a vast continent could produce such a river. Still, uncertainty lingered. Columbus may have continued to cling to the belief that he was in Asia, but the evidence increasingly pointed to a previously unknown land. In a letter to the Spanish monarchs, he described the region as a boundless new dominion that would one day belong to their subjects, a world entirely different from any we have known. By this time, however, Columbus's health was deteriorating badly. Years of hardship at sea, compounded by chronic dysentery from the previous voyage, had left him physically weakened and, according to modern historians, mentally unstable. In his letters, his imagination wandered toward the fantastical. He speculated that these lands might conceal mythical treasures, sacred relics with the power to rule humanity, or even the fabled Garden of Eden, the origin of all life. Such grandiose claims made it increasingly difficult for the Spanish court to trust him, and upon returning to Hispaniola, he found the colony in chaos. The settlement at La Isabela, now under his son Diego's command, was plagued by open rebellion against the Columbus family's authority. Facing a crisis he could not control, Columbus sent urgent letters to Spain requesting aid. But these pleas became the perfect justification for the royal government to intervene. Francisco de Bobadilla, a nobleman appointed by the crown, was dispatched to investigate the unrest, bring the colony under direct royal control, and evaluate Columbus's leadership. When Bobadilla arrived, Columbus greeted him with arrogance and suspicion, refusing to relinquish authority. This only deepened the rift. Before long, the royal envoy arrested Columbus, charging him with concealing wealth from the crown, abusing his power, and even plotting to turn Hispaniola into a personal fiefdom for his native Genoa. The verdict was a humiliation, unlike anything he had faced before.
Shackled in iron chains, Columbus was placed aboard a ship and sent back to Spain as a prisoner. By the time he arrived, his authority over all territories in the New World had been completely stripped away.
In May 1502, Columbus was granted permission for a fourth and final voyage, but under strict conditions. Above all, he was forbidden to set foot in Hispaniola. The stated aim this time was not colonization, but exploration, to push further along the coasts north of the lands he had already charted, still clinging to the hope of finding a direct sea route to the fabled East. During this last expedition, his fleet skirted the coastlines of Central America. In one moment of extraordinary proximity, they reached the Isthmus of Panama, standing less than 20 kilometers from the Pacific Ocean. Yet no navigable strait revealed itself, and with each passing week, the journey descended into a chain of hardships: violent storms, shipwrecks, dwindling supplies, fierce resistance from indigenous communities, and encounters with dangerous wildlife. The crew's domination of the locals was no less ruthless than before. Both native peoples and the environment itself bore the brunt of the Spaniards' relentless demands. But this time, nature proved to be Columbus's greatest adversary. Disease, hunger, and repeated disasters slowly crushed any remaining hopes for a decisive discovery. In November 1504, Columbus returned to Spain, his body weakened and his spirit fraying. Almost immediately, the last fragile thread of royal support snapped. Queen Isabella I, his steadfast patron through years of controversy, had died. Her absence left Columbus politically isolated, and King Ferdinand showed little interest in reviving his authority. In these final years, Columbus remained consumed by a deep, almost unshakable conviction that his voyages had been divinely guided. He claimed to have expanded Christendom's sacred domain beyond anything the crown could have imagined. He boasted of having discovered more than 1,700 islands, not even counting Hispaniola, which he compared in size to the whole of Spain. But behind these grand declarations lay a more troubling reality. His mental state was unstable, clouded by frustration, resentment, and the lingering effects of illness. The Spanish court's response to his claims was silence. Though not destitute, Columbus's later life was marked by disappointment and loneliness. Historians today view his legacy with deep ambivalence, rooted in two undeniable truths. First, his voyages brought catastrophic consequences for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, especially in the Caribbean, where cultural annihilation and mass death occurred within a generation. Second, in purely maritime terms, he was the first European to establish sustained contact between Europe and the lands across the Atlantic in the 15th century, an achievement that reshaped world history. On May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus died quietly in Valladolid, ending the turbulent life of an explorer whose actions forever altered the course of the human story, and whose legacy remains fiercely debated to this day.